Your heart is broken. There's nothing but a feeling of emptiness right now. God bless each and every one of you and the blessed memory of the one you lost. This nation grieves with you. Take some solace from the fact we all grieve with you.
Major Garrett and Ed O'Keefe join me now. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent, and Ed is a CBS News political correspondent. Good to see both of you. I want to start with this grim milestone. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany was asked about the president's response to the death toll reaching 100,000, and here's what she had to say Thursday.
Yesterday, the U.S. hit 100,000 deaths from the coronavirus. That happened at around 6 o'clock yesterday evening. It took until about 9 in the morning for the president to recognize that on Twitter. What took him so long?
Look, the president recognized that landmark before we even hit it. The president, that was, after all, it was the impetus behind him lowering the flag to half-staff. He did that for several days, and that was an acknowledgement of that number approaching, and he acknowledged it in a tweet this morning. But
we hit 100,000 yesterday evening, and it took 13 hours, some odd hours, for him to recognize that and tweet about it.
And far in advance of that benchmark, as I noted, he lowered the flag to half-staff. The president has said, you mentioned 100,000, but the president has said one death is too many. He takes this very seriously. He said before, this is the hardest part of his presidency.
Major, what is your assessment of the way in which the president has responded to this grim milestone?
Well, first of all, as every family in our country knows, every death is meaningful. And milestones, big numbers, they carry tremendous symbolic weight, and 100,000 is almost an unimaginably large number, but so is 99,000, so is 94,000, so is 80,000. And for each and every family along that path to 100,000, this has been a devastating, tragic, and heartbreaking pandemic and reality that they've had to come to grips with. So the question is well placed. The president has a well-earned reputation for being quick draw on Twitter, on things that he wants to highlight, the things he wants to set in motion, the things he wants to memorialize as the president of the United States. He had every opportunity as this milestone was approaching to prepare the Twitter audience for that, and to let them know what his internal feelings were about this. And this might be a rare instance in this campaign season. We're still in the pandemic season predominantly, but the campaign is beginning to assert itself, where the president and the White House took some cues from the vice president, former Vice President Joe Biden, because his video announcement sort of placed this in a different emotional context. And I don't want to suggest the president was only trying to play emotional catch up on that, but it looks like that Twitter response, late though it was, did look as if it was reacting, at least in part, to what the vice president said last evening. But the simple truth is this, Elaine, we are, even though the death rate is declining, still averaging slightly more than 1,000 deaths per day. That's a lot every single day. The numbers are going to continue to rise even as we reopen, and maybe even more as we reopen. The question of reacting to death toll amounts will continue to stalk this presidency and everyone in his administration as the country continues to grapple with this. We have not turned the corner on this. The virus is still here. We're adapting differently and we're reopening cautiously. But the numbers are going to continue to rise, and the milestones will flow from that.
So, Ed, as you know, former Vice President Joe Biden has a profoundly personal connection to grief, suffering his own losses throughout the course of his life. Walk us through the former Vice President's message on the nation's coronavirus death toll.
Well, as you saw, it was a far more somber reflection on the milestone that we've crossed this week. And, you know, he frequently points out that he has been, affected personally, directly by death several times in his life, whether it was the sudden tragic death of his wife and daughter, and the injuries suffered by his children just weeks after he was elected to the Senate in the 1970s, or the death of Bo just 5 years ago this week. So it's something that is on his mind frequently. He can barely mention Bo, his son, without starting to break down, and so he tries to control or try to control for when exactly he does that, so that he's right in the right emotional state. And to Major's point, not only did this tweet come after the vice president's video message last night, but the decision to bring the flags down to half staff for 3 days came only after a letter from the congressional Democratic leaders, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who said that or suggested that there should be such a distinction, such an honor given to those that had perished. So it does seem that on this issue of sort of the emotional toll and the milestones that we're crossing, the president is lagging behind Democrats and other Republicans and other Republican leaders who seem to have a far better handle on the fact that this is a very emotional and draining situation for so many Americans.
Major, I wonder, is there any sense at all among those who advise the president, or is there any kind of indication that the president may feel compelled to hold some kind of public event to acknowledge these deaths, address the nation somehow, as there is this sort of collective grief that one picks up the front page of a paper and sees that stark figure, 100,000. As you said, 99,000 is a painful number for all of those families along the way. But I wonder if there are any kind of folks who are wondering if the president is going to be, feeling some sort of pressure to have some public, beyond just Twitter, beyond the flags at half staff, public acknowledgement in a way that maybe we haven't seen to this point.
I don't detect that pressure within the White House or those who are closest to the president's reelection campaign. The president wants to focus on the future. I was having a long conversation today with a senior House Republican who said, look, the president's not going to focus on recriminations. He's not going to focus on what happened in the past. He's only going to focus on the future and the economic rebound that he hopes will come with this reopening, and pushing ahead with therapeutic drugs, or certainly urging the pushing ahead of that, pushing ahead with the pursuit of a vaccine if that is attainable and then manufacturable and distributable at mass quantities. All of those things are going to dominate the president's focus internally at the White House and externally in terms of public pronouncements and rhetoric. I don't feel, and I haven't felt, as this milestone was coming. We were marching to it. We all understood this was coming. This is not a surprise, but its presence weighs so heavily on the country because it is an unavoidably large number, inconceivable just 60 days ago. And yet it is here. We knew it was coming. And the president knew it was coming. And he could have prepared himself, prepared the country, and oriented himself rhetorically to this inevitable day. He did not. And I don't detect any pressure for him to change his posture, which is future-focused, focused on therapeutics, focused on a vaccine, and to the degree it is possible for him, deflect blame for decisions not taken in January, February, and early March, which might have led to a different outcome.
Major, let's turn to the president's executive order on social media companies. Is that likely to have any impact on how these social media platforms operate, and why this issue now?
It will have an effect on the atmospherics around social media platforms and their urgency with which to engage White House and powerful congressional Republicans. Because the president is now saying very specifically there is a part of an existing federal law written and signed in 1996, Internet Decency Act, is I believe, if I remember correctly, the precise title, but 1996 is its year. And the president is saying there's a section in there that needs to be revisited. What is that section? 230. What does it do? It provides blanket legal immunity for Internet platforms for how they propagate content and their liability exposure for whatever content is there. And that is a serious bit of business for all of these tech companies. They want to keep that liability protection. And there are many on the right and the left who have said, When that was drafted in mid-1990s, the internet was a much different place, much smaller, much less powerful, much less profitable. And maybe some of that liability protection ought to be revisited. And that is something that tech companies were well aware of before this executive order. They are profoundly aware of it now. Now, to this executive order itself, it's probably not constitutional. It will clearly be fought in the courts. But energizing this conversation about reevaluating that law and seeing if Congress will change its mind about that sort of liability protection is a real issue. And tech companies simply cannot say, Elaine, that their hands have no internet blood on them, if you will. And I don't mean that literally, I mean that symbolically. Algorithms that they have create for them and profitize the way people have information distilled and reinforced to them. There's plenty of academic studies and social science studies that indicate that those algorithms have intensified and accelerated political partisanship and political polarity in this country. There's also plenty of evidence that it has made it much more difficult for local journalism to survive. That's a separate issue, but these are complex and big issues, and the tech companies have sort of had a general free ride in this realm. Well, this executive order, though probably unconstitutional and certainly subject to legal challenge, alerts them that this issue is real and they've got to pay attention to it. And I guarantee you, one of its consequences will be a even more rapid and even more impassioned engagement with the White House and congressional Republicans.
I want to bring into our conversation Caitlin Conant, our CBS News political director. Caitlin, when it comes to this executive order, these companies are, after all, private businesses. So how significant is it for a Republican president to issue this executive order, to issue an executive order regulating something that is a private entity?
Well, hi, Elaine. First of all, as we're talking about tech, I apologize for the technical difficulties in the Conant household.
We're all feeling them. No worries, Caitlin.
Exactly. But yeah, the president has long gone after private companies. He's made them a foe. This is not really a surprise. And the tech sector is one industry that he's been particularly focused on in terms of going into a back and forth over. But I believe I just got on the tail end of this, but I think what Major was just saying there is that there are many experts who question how effective this executive order will actually be that the president is making, because ultimately they say it will have to come down to Congress, who would make, who would have to decide that they were having a limit on free speech when it comes to the internet.
So this all links back, as you know, to the president's criticism of states expanding mail-in voting access. He claims there is widespread fraud, and White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany also addressed that Thursday. Let's go ahead and listen to that.
When you don't clean your register and you send out your entire register, auto send out these ballots, they end up in trash cans like in Nevada. They are subject to fraud, and that is extremely troubling. Well, I appreciate you bringing up this question, and specifically the component about the president using mail-in ballots. There's an important distinction, and I think it's lost upon a lot of people, but it's important to make, is that the president is okay with mail-in voting so long as you have a reason. He's not okay with mass mail-in voting, where you auto-send, as I said, to all of these voter rolls with people who are dead that are subject to fraud. That is the case.
Well, Caitlin, a number of states have allowed some form of mail-in voting for years, and Republican governors and secretaries of state are working to expand it. So where do the president's statements leave them?
Well, the president is clearly trying to paint a picture that mail-in voting promotes fraud. And that is something that he is using from the bully pulpit. But one of the women in our political unit, Sarah Ewell-Weiss, had a story on this on Tuesday that looks at how down bad in many of these states, they are taking measures to plan and prepare for an increased amount of mail-in voting. Part of this reflects the interest of voters, who increasingly say they would like it as an option as they are dealing with coronavirus concerns. And a lot of these are in primary states that happen to be on June 2nd. And so when you look at Pennsylvania, one of the first items on the GOP's the state Republican Party's website is how to register for mail-in voting and to do it safely. And right behind that text is an image of President Trump hovering over it. And it says, you can vote from home and you can do it safely. So that's one state that is looking at measures to do this. And other is Florida, where they have sent out emails encouraging people to register to vote from home. And we also see secretaries of state in Georgia and Kentucky who have urged people to vote from home amid the coronavirus. So there's an interesting dynamic here where although the president is trying to promote that this is a bad practice, that the Democrats are trying to steal the election from the national level in the bully pulpit, Republicans across the states are trying to take measures to both protect their citizens and figure out means looking forward to the general election.
Interesting.
Elaine,
It really would seem to be a contradictory message. Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Well, just in this same vein, because I've been doing a little work on this week in anticipation of some stuff we're doing for next week ahead of those primaries. We spoke yesterday with the California Secretary of State, when the president talks about sending ballots to every voter and the potential for fraud, the only state that's doing that right now, or that has plans to do it, is California. And he says that they will be sending them to the Secretary of State tells us that they will be sending ballots to active voters in the state. I asked for a definition of what an active versus an inactive voter is, and he didn't give me a very clear definition, but did say that it's essentially up to counties to determine who is considered to be somebody that's been participating in the last several cycles. Everyone gets a ballot, and several of the counties in California are opting into a new system this time that will allow people to track their ballot from election office to their house and from their house back to being counted. Similar to how you might track a package when you order sneakers online, you'll be able to do it in most California counties by November. He says, look, instances of fraud are minuscule in the nation's largest state, and he doesn't quite understand why the president and Republicans would be opposed to expanding access to participating in voting, which is an argument that other Democrats and Republicans have made across the country. The other interesting thing, Caitlin mentioned those Republican secretaries of state who have been pushing and expanding access to either absentee ballots or to the option of voting by mail, or who have been opening polling sites across the country to allow people to vote in person if they decide to do it that way despite the pandemic. We've had some real problems the last few days actually getting some of those Republican secretaries of state to talk to us, even though just even like a week ago, they were publicly speaking out in support of vote by mail and absentee balloting. So it shows you that there is some pressure on them probably from the president right now to at least not talk about it as much as they were talking about it even just a few days ago.
Right. They certainly, I'm sure, don't want to be seen as somehow contradicting the president's statements. Ed, one last question for you. How is the Biden campaign responding to the president's critiques of mail-in voting?
Well, they say, look, the access to it should be expanded as much as possible. It's up to each state to decide. But there are bigger concerns for Democrats generally about voter suppression issues. There are numerous lawsuits across the country right now challenging exactly when and how absentee ballots are doled out or available to voters across the country, concerns with access to polling locations, issues, for example, in Georgia, where Stacey Abrams, the former gubernatorial candidate, her organization, as our Tim Perry reported today, is now going to be tracking absentee ballot concerns that voters may have there ahead of their June 9th primary. So for Democrats, at least, it is something that they often start to worry about this time in an election year. And Biden has made very clear that he would prefer people have as much access and in whatever way they can to the voting booth. Notably, though, remember when Wisconsin held their primary in early April against the objections of the Democratic governor?
Yes.
Bernie Sanders at the time was saying people should be able to vote by absentee. Maybe they delay the primary. Biden didn't go that far at the time. I think he understood that that was perhaps the primary that was really going to start to put him on a path to where he is now, which is on the verge of officially clinching the nomination. So there's some sensitivity to the fact that each state gets to decide. But certainly now the Biden campaign very interested and concerned about making sure people are able to vote however they prefer to. They hired this week a voter protection director, essentially a fancy name for a lawyer who knows election law, and there will be dozens more of them helping out that campaign across the country, especially in the key battleground states leading into November.
All right.
And Elaine, if I could weigh in on a couple of points here real quick.
Yeah.
Elaine?
Sure. Yep.
Could I just add one other thought? So this sort of brings us back to where we started this conversation, which is I said the president wants to focus on the future, and he wants to focus relentlessly optimistically about the future. And one of the things that is underlying this whole criticism of mail-in ballots is it's probably unnecessary. We don't know that to be true medically. Public health officials aren't prepared to say that. But the president wants to sort of assert that. Nothing to worry about in the fall. Well, lots of states and counties are saying there might be something still to worry about in the fall, which means we have to take other actions to ensure that those who are concerned or those who might be at risk have an alternative, a legal and verifiable alternative to balloting. But one of the things the president wants to sort of suggest, and it's part and parcel of this hostility to mail-in balloting, is it may not be necessary. We can do it the old-fashioned way. You can go in person. You're not going to have anything to worry about this fall. We don't know that to be true, but the president wants to assert that to be true. And as is so often the case with this president, he can take something that has a scintilla of truth and hyperventilate to a degree that some of his supporters believe it is completely true. Can there be fraud in mail-in balloting? Yes, there can be. Are there rare instances? Yes, there are. And are there mechanisms that you need to ensure to verify a signature or verify registration? Yes, but to Ed's point, and I think California is a classic example of this, if we can track our sneakers, we should be able to track our vote. And the sooner we can do that, and the more rapidly maybe this pandemic encourages us to do that, the better off all voting will be. One last point, I don't mean to belabor this, but the statistical truth is this, Elaine. One of the president's most reliable constituencies are voters 55 and older, predominantly white but not exclusively white. And protecting their access to the ballot in whatever way possible is an imperative for the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign. One of the ways to do that is to make available absentee balloting, so they're not concerned about exposure to COVID-19 should that continue to be a health risk in the fall. This is a big issue for the campaign and for Republicans to make sure those voters can vote safely so they do vote and their votes count. That is also running counter to the president's hyperventilating that every mail-in ballot initiative is just a pathway to massive fraud. A, it's not, and B, it goes against one of his most particular and acute political interests.
Really excellent points as people try to evaluate some of the statements and the rhetoric that they're hearing here and try to make a decision in their democracy come November. Major Garrett, Ed O'Keefe, and Caitlin Conan, always wonderful to have your analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.
And we are going to take a quick break. We'll have much more news straight ahead. Stay with us. You're streaming Cbsn, CBS News, always on. Protesters filled the streets of Minneapolis after a black man died in police custody earlier this week. As Jeff Pegues reports, the demonstrations are becoming increasingly violent.
As fires burned in Minneapolis Thursday, the mayor called for peace while acknowledging the reasons behind the unrest.
What we've seen over the last 2 days is the result of so much built-up anger and sadness.
The violence was sparked by Monday's death of George Floyd, who could be seen on video with a police officer's knee on his neck for several minutes while he struggled to breathe.
We feel as if there was a knee on all of our collective necks. A knee that says black life does not matter.
Most protesters were peaceful, but some clashed with police. Looters broke into nearby businesses and some set buildings on fire. The city's fire department says it responded to around 30 fires overnight. There are several structures that have been destroyed, not just this one that you see behind me. There are several in this area, and in fact, what we're told is that this was low-income housing that was being built. I don't know if the people who did this knew that, but that is the result of what happened overnight here. Among those demanding justice in Minneapolis Thursday, the Reverend Al Sharpton. Sharpton was joined by the family of Eric Garner, who died after a New York City police officer put him in a chokehold while arresting him in 2014.
This is just opening up an old wound, pouring salt into it.
We're going to make sure that this prosecution goes down.
The mayor has asked the governor for help and authorized a unified command structure to bring in additional resources to stop the violence. Jeff Pegues, CBS News, Minneapolis.
New government guidance is questioning the accuracy of coronavirus antibody tests. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say the tests could be wrong half of the time. As Anna Warner reports, it comes as two major companies roll out expanded programs.
We feel really lucky that we've recovered and, it's behind us.
Lisa Wagner and her husband, Matty Goldberg, fell ill from coronavirus in March. In April, they had antibody tests before visiting her elderly parents. They came back positive.
We feel a little bit like we have a superpower, but only within, not 100%.
So you're more confident now?
Yeah. Definitely.
For now, I feel like I have some immunity.
Many people want antibody tests, and major testing companies, including Quest Laboratories, are now offering them. Quest launched a program this week for employers that it calls Return to Work, which includes those antibody tests. One company signing up, Holiday Retirement, which runs 261 independent living communities for seniors nationwide. CEO Lily Donahue wants to test her 8,000 employees.
Frankly, if you know that most of your employees are tested positive for the immunity, you may prioritize how that person works, right?
She hopes the program will help her figure out how best to deploy them.
So if you have a positive case in your community where there's a resident that has COVID, it may make sense for that immunity or, the person who tested positive to be doing more of the interaction.
And Quest's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jay Wolgemuth, told us the tests are useful.
Once we identify a person who has a positive antibody test, and we've determined that they are not currently infected with the virus, we now know that that person is very unlikely to bring the virus with them into the workplace.
Quest is also now offering antibody tests on demand to consumers on its website for $119 plus a $10 service fee. In marketing emails like this one, the company calls the test an immune response blood test and says understanding this gives you insight on whether it's right to return to work, school, and activity.
Do you agree with that statement?
I don't agree with that statement.
He's Michael Osterholm, who heads the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy.
Many of the individuals who end up being test positive are going to be false positive, meaning that they don't really have the antibody. Even if you do have it, we don't know what it means yet. And so I think it's very premature to market these tests like this. And I think that it's almost preying on the vulnerability of the public today.
Preying on them, you say, because
I did. Yeah, I think selling antibody tests to the general public right now is just plain wrong.
But Quest's Dr. Wolgemuth disagrees. He says the tests his company uses are clinically validated and appropriate.
So how would you respond to somebody who says, look, it looks like Quest also saw a lucrative business opportunity here?
Yeah, I mean, we've been responding to this pandemic in a way which is, I think, quite selfless and is motivated by making a difference for the pandemic.
I'm just wondering if people might get the wrong impression when you say it's going to give you insight on whether you can return.
Yeah, I think it absolutely does provide insight to an individual, whether they're likely to bring a virus into the workplace or not. I think we need to be clear that this testing is not used to determine who goes back and who does not go back to work. So, to your point, if there is any language there that appears to indicate that, then that's something that we would remedy.
Regarding that marketing, the company later told us that those tests should be part of a holistic decision considering several factors in any work environment. Quest also says consumers will have physician oversight as part of this process. It says the tests can be helpful for both individuals and employers when considered in proper context. Now, CBS News' medical contributor, Dr. David Agus, told us that he tells his patients not to get antibody tests because he can't tell them whether they definitively have immunity. Anna Werner, CBS News, Berkeley, California.